Okay, I'm going to talk about Levi-Strauss, and I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't take 15 or 20 minutes, but that just sort of guides you while you read. And the first thing I want to point out is that Levi-Strauss begins by criticizing other schools of criticism. He says specifically on the right-hand side of 503, that when we start talking about affectivity, which is a way of describing reader-oriented criticism, we're still getting involved in the psychological school of criticism. So he doesn't feel like that's doing enough structuralist work. And he's writing this in 55, so he's already responding to the very beginnings of reader-oriented criticism, but it hasn't even come to the fore yet. Okay. At the top, on the top right-hand side of page 504, I wonder if I can set this on the keyboard. Yes? He writes, with myth, everything becomes possible. If you're reading a myth, he's talking about myth. I'm going to compare it to like a fable. If I'm reading a fable, the turtle can do whatever it wants, or the rabbit can do whatever it wants, right? We're not holding it to some standard. With myth, everything becomes possible. But on the other hand, this apparent arbitrariness, where everything is possible, is belied by the astounding similarity between myths collected in widely different regions. What he's saying is that if anything can happen in a myth, why is it true that myths are so similar across different cultures? He says that, therefore, the problem, if the content of a myth is contingent, meaning it can be anything, how are we going to explain the fact that myths throughout the world are so similar? And then he goes on to talk about Jung's archetype, which Bressler will talk about, although we haven't gotten there yet. And then he mentions on the top left-hand side of 505, the Saussurean principle of the arbitrary character of the linguistic sign, which should make you feel very smart because you know what that means. And he's talking about how different structuralist activities have sort of allowed him to get to this argument. He wants to say that myth is organized like a language. Okay, not that it is a language, but that it's organized like one, which is to say there is a langue. So a parole would be any given telling of any given myth, whereas a langue is the structure of that myth independent of how it turns up in any particular culture. And again, we're going to talk about this more specifically in class, like in terms of examples. But he says on the right-hand side in the middle of 505 that the heresy of the paraphrase, I don't know how to read the, I assume it's Latin, to translate is to betray, reaches the lowest truth value, which means that translating a myth just gives us a different version of the myth in a way that isn't better or worse than the previous version. He ends up saying about the Oedipus myth that every incarnation of every version you've read, Freud's Oedipal complex, everything that you think you know about it, those are just different versions of the myth. Okay. The part where he talks about gross constituent units and mythemes and bundles of relations, we're going to talk about that in class, but it's actually less important that you understand that than that you understand his sort of charts. The easiest one to understand, perhaps, is the, he's talking about an orchestral score, but let's imagine he's talking about playing cards on the top right-hand side of 507. If I pulled an ace of spades, a two of spades, I'm doing this wrong, but a 4, 7, 8, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 1, 4, 6, 7, 8, etc. You would, and you didn't know much about cards or counting, you would realize that there were two ways to align them. You could align them in, as he's done here, columns according to aces, twos, threes, fours, 5, 6, 7, 8. Or you could align them in terms of rows, where you would have the clubs up here, the spades here, the hearts here, and the diamonds here. That's what he's talking about. That the way in which we lay down the cards, 1, 2, 4, 7, 8, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, is one thing, is diachronic, because it relies on us doing something across time. But that we can also read the cards synchronically, which is to say all of the aces can line up, all of the twos can line up, threes, fours, etc. can line up. Which means that we can read, if there's a shuffled deck of cards and I lay out all the cards, we will realize at some point that we can read it in two different ways, just as he talks about a score of music. You read it from left to right, diachronically, but you also have to read it synchronically. You have to read the chords together as you read diachronically across. And when he gets to the Oedipus myth, and we're going to talk about this diagram a lot because frankly it's involved and weird, but he wants to talk about how you tell the story in order, but if you line the events up in columns, you can see something else about this, about the myth. Okay. He ends up by saying on the left-hand side, about halfway through 511, that myth, that there's always repetition in myth, over and over and over and over. The myths are the same, but slightly different, but parts of it are the same. The function of repetition is to render the structure of myth apparent. We're meant to understand a myth as that we're meant to understand the structure. What's important and meaningful about the myth is that the structure is the thing that tells the story. And it's important to us that we understand how the story gets laid out synchronically, as well as the story as it's told, just as if it were a story. Okay, good luck.